Yeah, hi, Hersai here, 20th of February 2021, Wellington, New Zealand. This is actually probably one of my favorite topics, probably one of the favorite videos as well of all, and that is the priceless adage that hard work conquers all. And I'll be building on an example or a story that my father used to tell me, simply the old space race during the Cold War, the space race between the Americans and the Soviets, or the Russians at the time. And basically, it really is an amazing story. And just in summary, after World War II, 1945, the Americans had much, much more than the Russians did. For running a space race. After World War II, they actually said to a lot of Nazi scientists, the German Nazi scientists in Europe, they said, "Don't worry what you did during World War II, what technologies of Hitler's that you worked on, which were dangerous, that were meant to do nothing but kill people, such as his V2 missile, V for Vengeance. They said, don't worry about that. Don't worry about how many people you did kill or how many people you murdered, even if indirectly in the concentration camps, the extermination camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau. Don't worry about that. Come to us. We will give you citizenship. We'll pay you a rite of passage. We will give you a high-paying job. We want you to work on our defenses, our missiles, and of course, what eventually became their space program, because missiles and rockets are very similar. And the only difference is that one goes up vertically, whereas the other one goes horizontally. One's supposed to send payloads into space or things into space, whereas the other is supposed to go and kill people. But the physics and the science behind them is actually quite similar. So that's why the Americans wanted the Nazi scientists, and they really got a lot of them, much more than the Russians got. The Russians also tried to get their hands on some, but were not able to really get hands on many. The most famous one being Werner von Braun. Werner von Braun, who was a Nazi scientist who then became the head of the American space program. The head of the Russian space program was someone known as Sergei Korolev, and he had spent, poor guy, he had spent 20 years in a gulag or a Russian concentration camp run by Stalin during its awful industrialization times when he was really trying to revamp Russia and really industrialize the country. So at the end of World War II, the Americans had the Nazi scientists, they had the facilities, they had money. The Russians didn't really have much of that at all. They were working in Kazakhstan on their space program because that was their most southernmost state. The closer you are to the equator for launching rockets, the better it is for launching rockets, which is of course why Americans had their space center, the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral in Florida. So it's amazing. The Russians didn't have much. The Americans had the Nazi scientists, the facilities, the money. The Russians didn't have much. They were working in Kazakhstan in horrible working conditions and horrible weather. They were so poor that they were using cardboard boxes as desks. Can you believe that? Can you believe that? And but unbelievably, what the Russians accomplished, the first satellite in space, which was Sputnik in 1957, the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin in 1961, the first manned spacewalk. That's when they send a man into space and he's able to actually leave the aircraft and float about in space, basically what they call a manned spacewalk, and come back inside. First manned spacewalk in 1965, first woman in space in 1965, first probe to the moon, first probe to land on the moon, first probe to Mars, even if just, I think only about 20 seconds after landed got scooped up in a snowstorm. Sorry, not a snowstorm, a sandstorm, but still, it was the first to land there. So, first probe to the moon, first probe to land on the moon, first probe to Mars, first probe to Venus. So, the Russians had all of those firsts. I've lost count of how many firsts they had. The Americans beat them in only one main way. Obviously, first man on the moon, and even that is shrouded in conspiracy, which I'm sure you've all heard about time and time again. And so, coming back to the old adage, hard work conquers all. The Americans had so much to start by, whereas the Russians beat them so many times. Even if the Americans did get to the moon first, the Russians beat them in all those other ways. In fact, the Russians were actually trying to get to the moon as well, and their aim was to get to the moon by 1967 to mark 50 years since the October Revolution of 1917. Imagine that, a country which was basically on the verge of collapse, which was an absolute mess, having a revolution in 1917, and becoming a superpower at the end of the World War II, 1945. Then by 1967, sending a man to the moon, basically being on top of the world, all that in just 50 years. Amazing. And many people, well, many historians argue that the Russians actually would have done it by then. But what really happened was, well, one, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the Soviet premier at the time, he wasn't giving enough funding to the Russian space program. And secondly, quite sadly, the head of the Russian space program, Sergei Korolev, also got very sick. By the time he died, which I think was not long after that, he had a tumor in his stomach, in his tummy, the size of a fist. He was working very hard. He was supposed to be taking more rest because he was sick, but he was putting everything into his career. That's how much he cared about it. So some historians even argue that had he not got sick, had Sergei had the Russian premier Nikita Khrushchev at the time put enough money or more money into the space program, the Russians actually would have got to the moon first in 1967. So even that says a lot. But coming back to the adage, how hard work conquers all, well, that illustrates it perfectly. I mean, think about how much the Americans started off with, but compared to the Russians, but how much the Russians accomplished ahead of the Americans because of hard work. There's nothing like hard work. Hard work truly conquers all. Thank you.